Florida may not be known for great differences in elevation, but even small changes result in distinctly different plant communities. Whether dominated by pine forests, hardwood hammocks, or scrub communities, upland habitats provide unique and important ecological contributions to the Florida environment. So join us as we explore Florida's fascinating upland habitats. Welcome to the Florida Master Naturalist Program, an environmental education curriculum designed to increase awareness and appreciation of Florida's natural resources. Your host is Dr. Marty Main, wildlife ecologist with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Join Marty and his special guests as they take you on a tour of Florida's spectacular natural world.
Historically, pine communities dominated much of the Florida landscape. In fact, even today, pine habitats still constitute most of Florida's natural areas, and in fact have been called the matrix into which other habitats, such as wetlands and hardwood hammocks, are interspersed. During this video, we're going to explore Florida's pineland communities, and let's start with longleaf pine, which once dominated much of Florida, and in fact, much of the coastal plain of the southeastern United States. Longleaf pine once ranged from Virginia to Texas and covered nearly 90 million acres. Straight and towering more than 100 feet tall, ancient longleaf pines were once the most valuable trees in America. They were highly valued for all building purposes, especially for masts and planking and pitch, tar, and turpentine needed to build sailing ships during the 1800s. Even the keel of the USS Constitution, known as Old Ironsides, was a single beam from an ancient longleaf pine. Relentless logging all but eliminated virgin forest by 1920, and today, longleaf pine encompasses only about 2 to 3% of its historical range. Not all longleaf pine habitats are the same. Sandhills, clay hills, flatwoods, these habitats vary because of slight differences in soils, topography, and moisture. Let's begin our exploration of several longleaf pine communities by traveling to Florida's Panhandle. Our first stop is the driest of the longleaf pine habitats, where we'll meet Kevin Robertson, a fire ecologist with Tall Timbers Research.
Marty, this is a good example of a longleaf pine upland sandhills community.
Kevin, the first thing I notice is that this is a very open habitat.
That's right. The chief reason for that is fire. We have very frequent fires here, one every 1 to 5 years.
Right, I see. I noticed that the longleaf pines have evidence of fire on them. Tell me a little bit about the adaptations of the longleaf pine to fire.
Well, first of all, the adult longleaf pines are extremely resistant to fire. It's very difficult to kill a longleaf pine with fire unless it's been badly scarred. Also, its very long pine needles form a great fuel for fire, and it produces a higher biomass than any other tree in pine needles, and there are also chemical properties of the needles that help it to burn very well. So it actually enhances its fire environment with its own needles.
I understand also that the juvenile longleaf pine is uniquely adapted to fire.
That's correct. They have a very dense bunch of needles around the apical meristem so that even at the very earliest stages it can survive fairly intense fires.
I see. Now, I noticed some indicator species of a typical longleaf pine community, wiregrass being one.
That's correct. Wiregrass tends to be an indicator species of areas throughout Florida, whether sandhills or clay hills, and one of its characteristics is that it only flowers if it's burned from about early May to somewhere into the summer.
I noticed some other species here. Can you tell me a little bit about some of these hardwoods that are growing?
Sure. Well, some of the hardwood species that I consider to be indicator species of these well-drained sandhills include the bluejack oak, or Quercus incana, which you can tell by its velvety leaves, and also the sand post oak, or Quercus margareta, that we have an example of right here. Maybe one of the chief hardwood indicators in my mind is the turkey oak. And when I see this, I think that it's probably a sandhill area.
Now these oaks are very low growing. I imagine fire has something to do with that.
That's certainly true. If it weren't for fire, most of these small oak, what look like seedlings, would quickly turn into adults that would shade out all of the understory, and the entire community composition would change.
So fire's necessary to maintain this community.
That's correct. And it doesn't kill the individuals, but it just top kills them. So they sprout right back from the same roots year after year after year.
Now, in addition to some indicator plant species, we also have some indicator wildlife species.
That's certainly true. And one of them that comes to mind is the red-cockaded woodpecker, which depends on this open, frequently burned habitat for its survival, as well as very large longleaf pine trees.
Now, there's some invertebrates you were telling me about earlier as well.
That's correct. What we see to the eye is mostly the plants, but we don't see many of the insect life and the soil microfauna and the fungi that depend on these particular group of plants. And one indication of that is the fact that you won't see fire ants out here for the most part. The reason for that is the indigenous ants, like the harvester ant, keep the invaders out, keep out the fire ants, and that's true also of invading plant species. There aren't very many exotics in these natural communities.
Ah, so that's good from a management perspective, certainly.
That's certainly true.
Now, Kevin, one of the things that I've also understand is that the longleaf pine community in general has declined considerably in Florida and throughout the coastal plain.
That's also certainly true. The estimates say there are only about 2 to 3% of what there once was. There are various reasons for that. One of them, of course, was logging. But even the cutting of the trees doesn't necessarily eradicate where most of the biodiversity is, right here in the understory. So another reason is fire suppression. Because as we said, without the fire, you can't keep these hardwoods in check and keep this large number of native herbs and grasses within the community. And of course, the other reason is development, including uses for agriculture. Because one characteristic of this native understory is that it's highly sensitive to soil disturbance. It has to do with it being adapted to fire and putting all of its resources underground so it can resprout after a fire.
Right.
But if you disturb that soil, then it has no more resources and it tends to be invaded by weedy plants, and we lose that native biodiversity.
Biodiversity also changes for natural reasons. Next, we'll explore an ancient longleaf pine community where plant diversity increases in response to soil differences.
Marty, this is an example of a longleaf pine upland clay hill community, and it's an old growth forest where we're standing right here, one of the few in the southeast. It's called the Wade Tract. It's never been cut or harvested as far as we know.
So this is what these communities must have looked like when the Europeans first arrived.
That's correct. You notice how open it is, and early accounts said how easy it was to travel by horse or wagon for hundreds of miles.
Kevin, tell me a little bit about why this is called a clay hill community.
Well, the geology is a little bit different. For this or that reason, there was a lot more clay deposited as marine sediments than compared to some of the more sandy areas. And because of that, we have soil that's more mesic and moist and has a higher nutrient content. It's better developed, deeper A horizons. And that allows many more species to exist here than in the sandhill communities.
So this holds more water as well.
That's correct.
Yeah, and I noticed that there seems to be a lot more plant growth here.
That's right. This area was burned only a year ago, and you can see how much vegetation has already responded.
Right, so the plants are obviously well adapted to fire, but wildlife are adapted to fire as well.
That's right, and different species respond to fire in different ways. Many go down into burrows beneath the ground because the heat of the fire only penetrates about half an inch below the soil. That's one of the reasons that gopher tortoise burrows are so critically important in this habitat, and also holes that result from burnt out tree stumps as well. Other species are able to get away from the fire by going down to lowlands or other areas that don't burn.
Right, and also there's the issue of snags as wildlife habitat in these communities.
That's right, and this site is one of the few places in the southeast that you'll see snags remaining. It's because of the conservation easement that was signed on this property that required them to remain because of their values to wildlife habitat.
Now, if we continue downslope, the habitat, I assume, will continue to get wetter.
That's right, and there'll be some community changes that go along with that. As you can see, Marty, we're getting closer to the bottom of the slope here, and as the soil gets moisture, the community begins to change in different ways.
I see a lot more hardwoods here, obviously.
Right, and it'll go into a gradual transition into a completely hardwood-dominated area in the lowest part of the drain.
Now, we've got some large hardwoods in this area, but still fire is obviously an important component.
That's right, it wouldn't be open like this if it weren't for fire, but from time to time, a hardwood like this oak tree here or this persimmon behind us can get through, And even with severe fire scars, like you see on some of these trees, they continue to survive.
Kevin, I also noticed that there's some slash pines in this area.
That's right. Slash pines tend to be limited to the wetter areas on the landscape, unlike the longleaf pine, which can be found in either one.
Right, so we have a mix here. Kevin, when we talk about pines, that brings up a question I wanted to ask about pine plantations.
Mm-hmm.
How do they equate to these natural communities?
Well, one of the main things about managing this kind of community for its biodiversity is to keep it open like this. If you plant pines really close together, it's too much shade on the ground for most of these herbaceous species to exist, and so we end up losing a lot of our biodiversity.
Before we end, Kevin, can you comment on some of the conservation implications of managing these areas in the Panhandle?
I think some of the main factors, as we mentioned before, include fire, also keeping soil disturbance out of the area, and keeping this open park-like habitat so that we can keep the large number of indigenous species that we have here. Florida, of course, has great development pressures, and that's always a big issue here.
As we travel south, the topography changes, and the longleaf pine communities also change and tend to include greater numbers of turkey oaks. For this reason, these communities are often referred to as longleaf turkey oak habitats. Longleaf pine sandhill communities in central Florida take on some different characteristics. This is Reed Noss. He's a professor of conservation biology at the University of Central Florida. Reed, can you tell me a little bit about this habitat?
Well, one thing you notice, Marty, is that the hills here in Central Florida aren't quite as pronounced as some other places in the state. But for Central Florida, this is actually pretty hilly. And, you know, there's a variety of differences as you go from the Panhandle down the peninsula. The plant species composition changes a bit. In this case, we're looking at a longleaf pine community that's in the process of being restored by the state park personnel.
I see, and obviously they're using fire to restore this habitat.
Yeah, this area was burned just within the last few months, and you notice how quickly things come back here.
Right. Now, longleaf pine, of course, are very adapted to fire.
Well, we just picked up a couple cones. As you can see, these cones are big, and in fact, they get about twice this size in some cases. They release these big seeds that fall into bare mineral soil after a fire, and they may stay in this, what they call grass stage as a seedling for 5, 10, sometimes as long as 15 years or more. They look like a grass.
Right, and they're highly resistant to fire in that stage.
Very resistant to fire. And then what happens, they start to grow very rapidly to get to a height where they can then become again invulnerable to fire. And at this stage, they're often vulnerable, but as you can see, this one did just fine.
Now, there's another pine tree that can sometimes be found in this community that has an entirely different fire strategy.
The sand pine, we've got some right over here. There's a good example of mature sand pine right there, Marty.
Oh, yeah.
And it's reproduced, it looks like. These are some of its babies, a few years old.
Well, the first thing I noticed is that these have grown up in a clump.
Yeah, this pine is very different. Look how spindly these things are. Short little stems, very narrow stems. And this pine is actually fire adapted, even though a fire in a longleaf pine sandhills that normally occurs, say, on a frequency of every 2 to 5 years would kill these. This pine has a different strategy.
Right, associated with the cones.
Basically, what happens is when you get hot fire come through, it might kill the adult, but the adult then opens its cones, its serotinous cones that are very closed, dense with sap, opens up, spills the seeds, and they grow up in profusion.
Sand pines are an opportunistic and short-lived species that depend on fire to create suitable growing conditions. When fire is suppressed, sand pines can form dense stands in longleaf pine habitat and may also form dense stands in scrub. As we move into flatter and wetter areas, the habitat changes into what is described as a pine flatwoods community.
As you can see, Marty, this flatwoods is aptly named. It's very flat.
Right. And I noticed that actually we have a different species of pine here.
This is a slash pine flatwoods. There's several kinds of flatwoods. We can have longleaf pine flatwoods, same species of trees we just saw in the sandhills. The sandhills tend to be, as the name implies, a little higher ground, deeper sand. Here in the flatwoods, very level ground, water table is close to the surface. Often there's a clay hardpan right below the surface, so water will be standing for part of the year.
Right. Now, the other thing that's really noticeable about this slash pine flatwoods is the strong shrub component.
And that reflects the increased soil moisture content. There's more water out there to spread around. So we've got Lyonias here, we've got blueberry, we've got saw palmetto, and that gets even denser if your sand goes a long time without a burn, or if you have burning more in the winter than in the summer.
All right, and there's a lot of emphasis these days on burning summer burns for various reasons, including flowering of wiregrass.
That's correct. And wiregrass, I'm glad you pointed that out, because that is the dominant grass both here in the flatwoods as well as in the more upland sandhills and clay hills.
All right, so fire is an important management technique in pine flatwoods communities.
Absolutely. These really burn just as regularly under a natural fire regime as the sandhills do.
And I understand that if it even gets a little wetter, we'll have another species of pine that is present.
Even wetter flatwoods are generally pond pine flatwoods. And the pond pine's unique because, well, it's easy to recognize. You can see a lot of the needles and small stems coming right out of the main trunk and the larger branches.
Right, and that'll often transition right into a bayhead.
Yeah. In fact, the pond pine community is pretty much a wetland. It's right in that ecotone between upland and wetland.
In addition to pond pine, there are 3 other pines that occur in North and Central Florida, but that are not abundant. These include the shortleaf pine, which occurs in a variety of habitats and is often a minor component of longleaf pine communities. Spruce and loblolly pine both occur as minor components of hardwood forests, but loblolly pine is also grown in pine plantations and is important as a commercial timber species. As we travel to extreme South Florida, the landscape changes, the hydrology changes, and this has some profound influences on pine flatwoods communities. Our next stop is Big Cypress National Preserve, where pine flatwoods take on a different character and are dominated by the South Florida slash pine, which possesses some unique adaptations. Our guide is Jim Snyder, plant ecologist with the U.S. Geological Service. Jim, the flat South Florida landscape has important seasonal influences on these pine flatwoods communities.
Sure. The fact that South Florida is so flat and so low means that if it rains much, the water collects and you develop sheet flow over the surface. This pineland that we're in right now, even though it's crunchy dry here in late May, come the middle of the wet season, maybe July, August, could be covered with water. There might be several inches of water here for several months during the year.
So in fact, during the summer, or the rainy season, this is actually like a wetland.
Yeah. The understory plants really, if you took away the canopy trees and got rid of all the palms, this could be a wet prairie. The same species, grasses, sedges, even the other forbs are also found in wet prairies.
Right. So South Florida slash pine are uniquely adapted to flooding events, but they have some other adaptations as well.
Well, South Florida slash pine is a very tough tree. I think it's sort of similar to longleaf pine found further north in that it can withstand very wet conditions in these hydric flatwoods, but it can also grow in very dry habitats. It's similar to longleaf pine also in that it has a relatively long needle and very resistant to fire.
Right. Now I understand that historically lightning was important.
Sure. I think lightning was one of the major sources of fire. As a matter of fact, I think there's a lightning-struck tree we could look at right over here. Before people were here in South Florida, lightning was the only source of ignition for fires.
Right, and of course lightning would be associated with thunderstorms.
Exactly. Thunderstorms in South Florida usually begin in May through September. Now, right now, we're in kind of an extended dry season. We haven't had thunderstorms yet, but it's very dry at the end of the dry season. Those early thunderstorms are the ones that give you the big fires, burn the largest area.
Right. Now, South Florida slash pine is uniquely adapted to fire with the needles and the bark, but there's other plants here that are also adapted to fire.
Sure. Well, obviously, everything that grows here has to be able to withstand fire. The palms are a very good example. We have both a cabbage palm, this little cabbage palm here, and lots of saw palmetto, which is typical of flatwoods. The way palms grow, the growing point is hidden well within the stem and well insulated from the fires.
Mm-hmm. So when a fire grows, it doesn't damage that growing part of the plant.
Exactly. It could burn the leaves completely off, but the growing point is still protected. Much like in grasses, the growing point is really below ground, so that a fire goes through, burns up the surface fuel, but the growing points are insulated by the soil.
There are some shrubs also that will grow into a pine flatwoods that aren't as well adapted to fire, actually.
Well, things like wax myrtle we don't see a whole lot here, but that's because this area is burned a lot. Hardwoods will often resprout from dormant buds that are below ground. but eventually they might get worn out and not survive a fire.
So if we don't burn this area for some time, shrubs like wax myrtle will come into the environment?
Exactly. There would be a trend towards hardwoods encroaching and developing in here. Yeah.
Now, we've mentioned some of the adaptations of plants, but there are also some, this habitat's important for some wildlife species as well.
Sure. Actually, here in extreme South Florida, there's a unique population of red-cockaded woodpeckers, which is a very unusual woodpecker in that it only nests in live pine trees.
Right, whereas most woodpeckers are...
Would have to be in dead trees and snags, which is typical of most woodpeckers.
Jim, with an endangered species such as the red-cockaded woodpecker, you must have some pretty specific management plans.
Well, sure. Actually, management for the red-cockaded woodpecker as part of this flatwoods ecosystem requires frequent fire. It's not possible anymore to let lightning run the system because fires might occur under severe conditions, etc. So the Park Service has a very aggressive prescribed burning program. As a matter of fact, it's the biggest prescribed burning program in the National Park Service.
Right, and I imagine your management program also addresses other issues such as exotic species.
Oh, sure. There's a very large program for exotic species removal here. The removal of Melaleuca was a major undertaking.
Well, with that, then this is a pretty healthy looking habitat. What are some of the major conservation issues for pine flatwoods throughout South Florida?
Well, obviously one is seeing that they burn frequently enough. This gets very difficult in urbanized areas where you have urban-wildland interface. And the loss of habitat, of course. This is prime real estate for the development of South Florida.
A rare type of pineland community in South Florida is pine rockland, which refers to the lack of soil and the limestone base rock exposed at the surface. Pine rocklands are dominated by South Florida slash pine and were once common on the Miami Ridge and in the Florida Keys. Today, pine rockland communities are nearly completely gone, having been converted to other uses, primarily coastal urban development. Pineland habitats throughout Florida have been converted to other uses, such as development and agriculture. We need to consider, however, the role of agricultural complexes in providing habitat diversity and wildlife values throughout the Florida landscape. To give us an idea of the role that agriculture plays in providing habitat for wildlife, we're joined by Ricky Bass, a farm manager for Duda & Sons in South Florida. Ricky, one of the things that impresses me when I come onto a large agricultural operation such as this one is the diversity of land uses across the landscape.
That's right, Marty. Here at Duda's at the LaBelle location, we have approximately 28,000 acres. 10,000 acres of it is in citrus. We have a couple thousand acres of sod, have a little bit of sugar cane, and about 12,000 acres of pasture land.
What about wildlife? Do they utilize these different agricultural crops?
Marty, you'll be surprised at how much wildlife utilizes not only citrus, but other commodities as well. You'll see does with their fawns a lot in the grove. You'll see bucks, laying underneath the trees, the citrus trees getting shade. So not only do they use the groves for food, but they use it for habitat as well.
Well, what about, do you look at a sod farm, for instance? You wouldn't think there's a whole lot of habitat value there.
Well, it's funny, you're right. You think when you look out on the sod field that there wouldn't be a whole lot of usage of wildlife, but sandhill cranes, hundreds of sandhill cranes every year use the sod fields for nesting, and it's a pretty sight to see the sandhill cranes out there.
Now, we mentioned the fact that you've got crops on a farm, of course, that's natural, but I also see lots of natural areas, such as this pine flatwoods.
That's right. Most of our refuge places or untouched areas are pine flatwood, but we do have cypress, we do have water reservoirs, so different type of species for each refuge.
A good example of how agriculture can produce a commodity while preserving natural areas is the grazing of cattle in unimproved pasture, or what Ricky refers to as natural pasture land. Ricky, this isn't what most people would consider to be a typical cattle pasture.
Marty, this is what I mean when I say natural pasture land here. It's still in its natural state, and we graze cattle on this.
Yeah, so you run cows through this pine flatwoods. I see that you've recently had a fire in here.
Yes, we prescribe burn all of our acreage at least every 3 years or so.
So you burn all your pine flatwoods and your wetlands too, I'm assuming?
Yes, out in the groves we have reservoirs during the dry season. When they dry up enough, we burn them as well.
So you guys have an active management plan for the farm?
Yes, we do, Marty. We try to control Brazilian peppers as well as tropical soda apples and any other exotic species that we see that we need to take care of.
What about your wildlife?
Oh, we have a great management wildlife program in place. We take data of all the game that we harvest, and we kind of review it every year and sit down with biologists and go over the data and see where we need to go with that.
That's great. That sounds a lot like what natural resource managers do for public lands.
Marty, farmers are good environmental stewards. You have to be today. With the way the economics are, you've got to take care of the land, because if it don't, it's not going to take care of you.
I hope this video has given you an opportunity to gain some appreciation for the diversity of Florida's pineland communities and the important ecological roles they play. During this video, we learned about several types of pineland communities that occur in Florida, which differ primarily due to changes in soils and hydrology. Fire is a critical component in all these communities. Without fire, pinelands would eventually become dominated by oaks and other hardwood species, to the detriment of the plants and animals that depend on open pineland habitat. The major pineland communities we explored included longleaf pine sandhill and clayhill habitats in Florida's Panhandle, longleaf pine turkey oak or sandhill habitats in central Florida, and slash pine flatwoods, which occur primarily in central and south Florida and along Florida's coastal areas. Pine plantations are common in North Florida, but do not possess the same ecological value provided by natural pineland habitats. We briefly discussed a couple of less common pine habitats, namely sand pine, pond pine, and pine rocklands. And we mentioned the shortleaf loblolly and spruce pines, which occur as minor components of other pineland or hardwood habitats. Finally, we discussed how pinelands are often incorporated into the agricultural landscape and the importance of this contribution to environmental stewardship in Florida. I'm Dr. Marty Main. Thanks for joining me on the Florida Master Naturalist Program.